The new prime was indeed an unusual place compared to other primes, although also strangely familiar at the same time. Many places upon it held the feeling to newcomers of being known to them, as though they had been there prior, but there was no explanation that could be reached for this despite many efforts to arrive at such. The fact of the matter was simply that they had indeed been to these places before, as such locations were in fact those very same places where they had had those feelings. But how? How could they be such? Well, there lay the strangeness of this prime, of its origins and purpose. You see, it had been fashioned in such a way as to enable places from other primes to be here, not recreated in their image, but literally pulled from their respective existences upon their home prime, ripped from one place and placed here, upon their new home, upon this new prime. The creator of this prime was the same who had created all of the ones before, as far back as time would allow one to peer. The gods as they were currently had their creator in Krillsis, and the demons had their source, and the primes had always had, and forever would have, their creator, in what those who knew such things called true prime. It was an identity to try and explain what was responsible, for even the greater gods, despite dealing with this entity, knew not its identity or location, merely that it existed and had the capacity to mould that which would become a new prime from their unknown and immeasurably vast power. Whereas most primes had been born in order to allow life to flourish, expand, and merely exist, this new prime had been created with an intent, a purpose, and as far as anyone could know, this was the first to be made so. Krillsis had been informed of the intent, and had worked alongside the true prime to craft a place that would be touched by life and Krillsis and no other. But although the touch of the all-highest of the gods was to be here, it was to be as an observer and nothing more. Their power was required to ensure that nothing could find it, and it would be beyond the reach of the daemons of all kinds, a role more akin to a protector or caretaker, and as such shielded this place from outside influence. This was achieved by placing it in a region between the planes where the astral could form a cocoon around it, masking it from the gaze of daemonkind, and acting as a natural barrier to ensure this place would remain untainted. To all looking upon it, they would see an ocean of astral energies, a vast sea and nothing more, at least until it was ready for such a time as they had prepared for it. There was, however, one condition that Krillsis had insisted upon, and the source of the primes had agreed to allowing. Although no other gods were to be a part of this place at its inception, they could be introduced at a later time once life was established, but only by the manner which had been agreed upon. They would need to come from a dying or threatened prime, and not by the hand or will of Krillsis. In short, they came with their transplanted lands as hitchhikers and refugees, and not via a packaged escort to spread their word by some formal arrangement. Life flourished upon this new prime for many millennia, allowing the seeded essence of what could be seen of as the wild to also flourish, despite their lack of direct presence at this time. As well the prime creator knew, anywhere life was present, the wild would be there. This was to be the only exception for the ruling of no interference from the gods, although the wild never took a direct hand, and merely granted a seed to furnish the prime with what had been requested. It did, however, mean that when the time would come to reunite this prime with the wild once more, it would be something that could be utilised for what was inevitably to transpire, as planned by the true prime. As nations rose, the first addition to the prime was eventually made. It was the arrival of denizens from a collapsing prime, where, for reasons they would eventually share, many of their deities had cast themselves down en masse and walked amongst the populace of that world. This prime had fought with the Nameless One, and had realised his limitations in their confrontations, despite their overwhelming raw power. They knew how to limit his prowess upon a prime, to prevent his gaining their god's abilities, and although their stepping down from godhood had been a necessity in their fight, the act had merely slowed down their prime's demise, as in the end it had fallen and been consumed in its entirety. But not before those who were chosen of their prime, as well as those who had cast themselves down, were extricated, along with one of their underground citadels, Anakar. The first to join this new prime from another were the first to have stood their ground and fought back against him. The first step in the hopes of this prime had been enacted. As they met with the denizens of the new prime, all went well, and integration was overall good, and with this mixing came the introduction of their god's influences upon this prime, and the first instances of followers to their respective identities, of ones who would normally have been granted power as followers and priests of their faiths, but due to the limitations the true prime had placed, such was not to be. These fallen gods had then sought to reclaim their power by establishing a link to Krilsis, and soon realised that their counterparts within the host of lights could not be reached, and only the faintest touch of Krilsis could be sensed. This meant that despite their kind being given another chance to fight when he would eventually discover them, it also meant that they would have to do so without their prior power. And here such power felt as though it would be limited by an unseen force. Several centuries after accepting this reality, and attempting to fathom how they could protect this prime from his touch, the second arrival occurred, and this one was in no way as smooth as prior. Upon an ancient prime, one long forgotten to the gods, the war against the Nameless One had also been waged. But here their outlook was very different. It was a prime filled with souls who fought tooth and nail against his horrors. And as it turned out, it was in the literal sense of the phrase. For they themselves were of the plains, and as such shared much in common with their enemy. They were transplanted, all of those who had survived the onslaught to that point, but no consideration was given to their natures, and with these creatures came great woe. These creatures were imbued by a god long forgotten, and the true prime knew nothing of this one's existence. But once upon the new prime it became very evident that a mistake had been made, and this became known as the first time of darkness, the end of what the denizens had referred to as their golden age. Upon arrival in their new home, they changed almost immediately, their bodies becoming less powerful, although still retaining their link to the power that was gifting them their blessings. This was not supposed to be possible, and yet it was happening all the same. They quickly set about building a vast structure, almost a mile across, and they all resided within this twisting complexity. It was constructed rapidly using their elemental atonement with the earth, another surprise that had been unknown. Such power was not supposed to be possible, as the elemental planes, along with all others bar the astral, were not touching the prime, thereby meaning such feats should not be able to take place, and yet they were, and this was something that was soon to be explained. Upon residing within their structure for a few weeks, and turning all away who had tried to welcome them, something new was sensed by those with the capacity, something unusual for this place. The original denizens felt it and were intrigued, as the last time new and strange magic had arrived, it had come along with the less newcomers, and this was an alluring and heady sense of sheer power, but of seemingly many types rolled into one. The fallen gods of the other prime, however, recognized many of these flavors of magic, and knew that what was happening was very, very bad. They warned all that they could, but without their power, and with little aid to their cause militarily, it was over fast. The builders of this intricate structure were, like them, gifted by a god. They sensed as such, but they were somehow more, somehow retaining their powers here. The how became apparent when an immense formless cloud was seen rising from the structure which was harnessing the lines of force it lay upon. Upon the night where the cloud first manifested, the skies were devoid of all stars, as though they were all taken from view, or something had held a black cloth to the sky. As this took place, several pieces of rock streamed through the skies, rippling with a fire only visible to those of divine nature, and of those who could see such, it was feared the very stars were falling. However, at this time there were so very few who had such a gift present, that these falling stones from the heavens were mostly unseen. It was inconsequential to what was about to happen, but was of great import in later times. Gigantic figures emerged from the cloud, and they were nightmarish in design, sharp edges and pointed horns adorning their twisting features. The denizens had carried their power within them, masking it within their divinely blessed forms, as the Nameless One had been known to do with their own host shell. They had carried their gods with them, and now their gods, after feeding upon the rich magic of this prime, were free once more. They were something long lost, long forgotten. They were part of the daemonic pantheon, and they had found a new place to call their own. They needed no link to the one known as Krillsis, for they had achieved their godhood through other means. They had been daemon, and now held divinity somehow, but none here knew of their true origins. Not that it would have helped combat what transpired. They each moved to a city, crafting demonic creatures in their image as their powers raised, and each taking a city by force only if it was needed, slaying any direct opposition as they went. They conquered the civilizations of this prime in scant months, despite any resistance that was mounted, as this prime had no defense against their kind. This was a daemon's prime paradise, only they did not intend to strip it bare and consume the power that lay here, or even the souls that dwelled, unless of course they fought back. They had other plans. They were unable to be reasoned with, as their cause was simply to amass more power, gain more followers to their cause, and enslave this prime as their own, to fuel their plans. The fallen gods from the other prime went into hiding, although many were discovered and paraded around for their new master's pleasure. Whipped, cut, and ridiculed, made to endure public torture, but never actually killing any of them. Why no killing of these ones? Simply put, they needed them. They needed them to pierce the veil, to push through the astral and into the planes, so that they could draw more power from them and further extend their dominion. They needed them for ritual sacrifice. A grand circle was inscribed upon the top of a flattened mountain peak. The mountain that had been the home of the citadel that had been first transported to this prime, but now lay as a blasted and lifeless area from the initial onslaught. The ruins of Anakar. This circle was marked with unknown symbols that none could identify, of knowledge long lost, and it is this circle that was used to pierce the veil, each use requiring an offering, in blood, of those born of the lights. A normal priest would not suffice, as their very nature would be insufficient, but a god who had cast themselves down, was created from the divine, was the divine. And this is just what they needed to breach this prison as they saw it, and open their secret ways back to the places they could extend their powers to. Other distant primes, and deep planes of demonic heritage that no living creature under the domains of Krillsis was aware of. Yes, The realms were darkened, the souls enslaved, and hope began to fail upon the world. But, despite this, it was as though the true Prime had wanted this to occur. For as they turned their attention outward, those who watched acted. Krilsis had accepted the rules of engagement, that he would not interfere or cede gods to this place, or connect it to other planes of existence. However, in order to facilitate their acts of transposition of places from other primes, there was an avenue he reasoned acceptable, and in keeping with his promises. And so he turned his focus to several small primes that he had kept hidden from others aeons past, and set about choosing champions to rescue this new prime from what was transpiring. The true Prime had ensured that Krilsis would have no other option than to draw upon the elder creations that he had nurtured over time, and knew that they were befitting for the task at hand, without breaking his request. For although immensely powerful, and nurtured directly from the god who crafted all current known gods, none of these creatures was of godhood, or of the planes themselves, hailing instead directly from long lost and forgotten primes. These creatures rallied in a single small prime, a staging area you could call it, a prime where the only reason to be there was that it was a stepping stone to prepare for the leap into conflict. Krilsis had created places like this from the remnants of an old, long-forgotten prime that was shattered before the Nameless One was even conceived, in the ever-evolving war against that which lies beyond the divine and primes. In time long-lost, wars had raged across the planes, across the dimensions of existence, and these remnants had been one of the last stands of many. This great conglomeration of mythical beasts readied themselves, and then, as the ritual was reaching its apex with the slaying of one of the fallen gods of another prime, one whose identity would be lost to time, they acted. They placed themselves between the desired destination of the ritual, and as it was enacted, as the lifeblood of their offering touched their ritual, they tore through the space between their current shard of prime and flooded into their prime via the now open passage that had been forged, not to the destination, but to their waiting numbers. The battle was fierce, and many on both sides were injured heavily, creature and dark god alike. The immense shifting forms being forced back by unknown adversaries with spectacular powers and prowess in combating them. It was as though they had been created for this very purpose, as though they had fought them before and had been readying for another round with their adversaries. Truth be told, they had been, but for another time when this dark pantheon had been in its infancy. They had waged wars upon many of the primes before eventually taking one of their own, and becoming the dark gods they now were. They hailed from the older, darker, and more deadlier times, where daemons and gods had fought hand to hand, power to power upon the planes and the primes, but thanks to events long past, this had slowed and almost ended, and as the flow of time had moved them along, their minds had forgotten what once was. But their complacency had allowed for a victory against them, and these new protectors continued to wage their war upon their eternal foes, forcing them back time and time again, until they retreated to the place where they had first been called forth, the gigantic twisted building. This action, this emergence of such wondrous and powerful creatures, inspired both fear and awe in the majority of the peoples of the world, and even the fallen gods who walked among them realized these creatures were something unique. They had needed divine intervention, and in a way they had gotten it. It was just not in any form they recognized as such, but the hand of Krilsis was most assuredly responsible. Once all had calmed, envoys from the New Ones met with the Dark Ones, and in time an agreement was reached. No more killing, and no more enslavement. This was the will of all outside the building, but it was on the condition that they would be allowed to leave this prime when a way could be found for them to do so. Agreements were drawn up, and many years of tenuous peace was held. During this time, all parties had agreed to meet and discuss their encounters with the Nameless One, and it became apparent that each had differing abilities to offer with regards to combating their mutual threat. The Dark Pantheon offered knowledge of their methods, as did the fallen gods, and the beasts of legend watched on and gave their insights too. A pact was formed in time between these factions, and it held truth through all that followed, despite what lay in store for them in times to come. They would band when needed, together, and rally to the defence of this prime so that, when called upon, they could stand a chance against him. It was to be their new home, all of them, and they would ensure that it would not fall. The true prime felt a warmth spread through them as the pact was formed, and they did not realise at the time that they had created what Karnefos had fought so long to achieve, and thus far had failed in doing. They had made a pact between the gods, the planar entities, and the daemons themselves, to stand against this universal threat, alongside those of the primes, even if they themselves did not grasp what it meant. Unification, the true prime thought as a warmth settled within. All shall one day be one, as once it was, as it shall be once more. The cycle will continue eternally, as it is willed. This prime had been crafted for one of many things, but this pact was the point that they knew they were on the right track. That this could very well be what was needed to bring about the end of the rampage of the Nameless One in time, or at the very least, allow them to be weakened or reasoned with by this opposition. But that was for times long to come into being yet, and they continued to make more plans to push the primes forward towards others, change trajectories, and influence reality as their nature allowed. They would aid life to exist, and this abomination of source and light would be stopped, here, upon this prime. They were sure of it. There would, however, be a problem with those who had made this pact, and it was something that had been overlooked by even them, as one by one the creatures of myth began to grow weak and wane. The places they had resided within were small pieces of prime, saturated with magic of their nature. In some fashion it could be said that they were daemons of their own tiny prime planes, for their powers were gifted from the magics they were eternally bathed within. Now they were upon this new prime, unable to travel back under their own ability, and they were dying as their magic leaked away, and the magic provided by this prime was not high enough to sustain them, their waning emanations merely fueling the lines of force upon this prime. When the first such beast breathed his last, they had just managed to craft a place to retreat to. It was a pocket realm, a self-contained plane linked to the place that had been created as the Great Circle, meant to allow travel to the primes via the dark rituals, but now it was retasked to act as a portal to anywhere that had a link to this prime. This pocket plane was created from the death of several more of their kinds, as they gave themselves to preserve the rest, as such vast power was required to enact their plan that it was impossible without such a sacrifice. There had been no other way. Despite Karnefos pushing their original pocket primes together in order to allow them a better chance for survival, and giving them a destination to tether to the prime, it was a distant and bleak existence compared to that which they had become accustomed to after being let loose. But they knew with heavy hearts that this path must be in order to assure they could enact their function at a later time. Those of the Dark Pantheon gave what they could to bolster this creation, and anchored it to several prominent points upon the prime, so that they could come and go when needed, and should the levels of magic allow it. Each of these places were where the odd rocks had fallen when the Dark Ones had first arrived, seemingly acting as anchor points to this prime for their magic. These would eventually be moved, thereby severing the connections and leaving fewer and fewer ways to traverse back to this prime. And as they were anchored to this prime and no other plane, this meant that with every anchor lost, they drifted farther and farther away, potentially being lost forever should they all be removed. The place of solitude lay a distance from this prime, but was able to slowly siphon magic from it in order to sustain them as they entered torpor, until the magic of the prime was elevated enough to allow them to survive once more. However, as the anchors would slowly be removed, such magic would flow slower, and as such end up putting them into a far deeper slumber than expected. And so, with a heavy heart, this prime said their goodbyes to the creatures that had been their myths and legends in the children's stories for generations, as well as their saviours and friends. And as they left, it hailed the true ending of the first golden age, and the beginning of the times of testing.